Dr. B.R. Ambedkar on Caste, Part 3. Thus, the existence of these means is identical with caste, and caste involves these means. This, in my opinion, is the general mechanism of a caste in a system of caste. Let us now turn from these high generalities to the caste in Hindu society and inquire into their mechanism. I need hardly premise that there are a great many pitfalls in the path of those who try to unfold the past, and caste in India, to be sure, is a very ancient institution. This is especially true where there exist no authentic or written records, or where the people, like the Hindus, are so constituted that to them writing history is a folly, for the world is an illusion. But institutions do live, though for a long time they may remain unrecorded, and as often as not, customs and morals are like fossils that tell their own history. If this is true, one task will be amply rewarded if we scrutinize the solution the Hindus arrive at to meet the problems of the surplus men and surplus women. Complex though it be in its general working, the Hindu society, even to a superficial observer, presents three singular ixorial customs, namely 1. Sati, or the burning of the widow on the funeral pyre of her deceased husband; 2nd. Enforced widowhood, by which a widow is not allowed to remarry; and 3rd. Girl marriage. In addition, one also notes a great hankering after sannyasa, renunciation, on the part of the widower, but this may in some cases be due purely to psychic disposition. So far as I know, no scientific explanation on of the origin of these customs is forthcoming even today. We have plenty of philosophy to tell us why these customs were honored, but nothing to tell us the causes of their origin and existence. Sati has been honored. Confa A.K. Kumaraswamy, Sati, A Defense of the Eastern Woman in the British Sociological Review, Volume 6, 1913, because it is a quote-unquote proof of the perfect unity of body and soul between husband and wife, and of devotion beyond the grave, because it embodied the ideal of wifehood, which is well expressed by Uma when she said, quote unquote, devotion to her Lord is woman's honor. It is our eternal heaven. And O Maheshwara, C.S. with a most touching human cry, I desire not paradise itself if thou art not satisfied with me. Why compulsory widowhood is honored, I know not, nor have I yet met with anyone who sang in praise of it, though there are a great many who adhere to it. The eulogy in honor of girl marriage is reported by Dr. Ketkar to be as follows, quote unquote, a really faithful man or woman ought not to feel affection for a woman or a man other than the one with whom he or she is united. Such purity is compulsory not only after marriage, but even before marriage, so that is the only correct ideal of chastity. Sorry, chastity. No maiden could be considered pure if she feels love for a man other than the one to whom she might be married. As she doesn't know to whom she is going to be married, she must not feel affection for any man at all before marriage. If she does so, it is a sin. So it is better for a girl to know whom she has to love before any sexual consciousness has been awakened in her. Hence, girl marriage. This high flown and ingenious sophistry indicates why these institutions were honored, but doesn't tell us why they were practiced. My own interpretation is that they were honored because they were practiced. Anyone slightly acquainted with rise of individualism in the 18th century will appreciate my remark. At all times, it is a moment that is most important, and the philosophies grow around it long afterwards to justify it and give it a moral support. In like manner, I urge that the very fact that these customs were so highly eulogized proves that they needed eulogy for their prevalence. Regarding the question as to why they arose, I submit that they were needed to create the structure of caste and the philosophies in honor of them were intended to popularize them, or to gild the pill, as we might say, for they must have been so abominable and shocking to the moral sense of the unsophisticated that they needed a great deal of sweetening. These customs are essentially of the nature of means, though they are represented as ideals. But this should not blind us from understanding the results that flow from them. One might safely say that idealization of means is necessary, and in this particular case was perhaps motivated to endow them with greater efficacy. Calling a means an end does no harm except that it disguises its real character, but it doesn't deprive it of its real nature, that of a means. You may pass a law that all cats are dogs, just as you can call a means an end. But you can no more change the nature of means thereby than you can turn cats into dogs. Consequently, I am justified in holding that, whether regarded as ends or as means, sati and forced widowhood and girl marriage are customs that were primarily intended to solve the problem of the surplus man and surplus woman in a caste and to maintain its endogamy. Strict endogamy could not be preserved without these customs, while caste without endogamy is a fake. Having explained the mechanism of the creation and preservation of caste in India, the further question as to its genesis naturally arises. The question or origin is always an annoying question, and in the study of caste it is sadly neglected. Some have connived at it, while others have dodged it. Some are puzzled as to whether there could be such a thing as the origin of caste and suggest that if we cannot control our fondness for the word origin, we should better use the plural form, that is, origins of caste. As for myself, I do not feel puzzled by the origin of caste in India, for, as I have established before, endogamy is the only characteristics of caste, and when I say origin of caste, I mean the origin of the mechanism for endogamy. The atomistic conception of individuals in a society is so greatly popularized, I was about to say vulgarized, in political orations, is the greatest humbug. To say that individuals make up society is trivial. Society is always composed of classes. It may be an exaggeration to assert the theory of class conflict, but the existence of definite classes in a society is a fact. Their basis may differ. They may be economic or intellectual or social, but an individual in a society is always a member of a class. This is a universal fact that early Hindu society could not have been an exception to this rule, and as a matter of fact, we know it was not. If we bear this generalization in mind, our study of the genesis of caste would be very much facilitated, for we have only determined what was the class that first made itself into a caste, for class and caste, so to say, are next door neighbors, and it is only a span that separates the two, a caste in an enclosed class. The study of the origin of caste must furnish us with an answer to the question as what is the class that raised this enclosure around itself? The question may seem too inquisitorial, but it is pertinent, and an answer to this will serve us to elucidate the mystery of the growth and development of caste all over India. Unfortunately, a direct answer to this question is not within my power. I can answer it only indirectly. I said just above that the customs in question were current in the Hindu society. To be true to facts, it is necessary to qualify the statement, as it connotes universality of their prevalence. These customs, in all their strictness, are obtainable only in one caste, namely the Brahmins, who occupy the highest place in the social hierarchy of the Hindu society, and as their prevalence in non-Brahmin caste is derivative of their observance, is neither strict nor complete. This important fact can serve as a basis for an important observation. If the prevalence of these customs in a non Brahmin caste is derivative, as can be shown very easily, then it needs no argument to prove what class is the father of the institution of caste. Why the Brahmin class should have enclosed itself into a caste is a different question, which may be left as an employment for another occasion. But the strict observance of these customs and the social superiority arrogated by the priestly class in all ancient civilizations are sufficient to prove that they were the organizers of this unnatural institution founded and maintained through these unnatural means. I now come to the third part of my paper regarding the question of the growth and spread of the caste system all over India. The question I have to answer is, how did the institution of caste spread among the rest of the non-Brahmin population of the country? The question of the spread of the caste all over India has suffered a worse fate than the question of Genesis. And the main cause, as it seems to me, is that the two questions of spread and of origin are not separated. This is because of the common belief among scholars that the caste system has either been imposed upon the docile population of India by a lawgiver as a divine dispensation, or that it has grown according to some law of social growth peculiar to the Indian people. I first propose to handle the lawgiver of India. Every country has its lawgiver who arises as an incarnation or avatar in times of emergency to set right a sinning humanity and give it the laws of justice and morality. Manu, the lawgiver of India, if he did exist, was certainly an audacious person. If the story that he gave the law of caste be credited, then Manu must have been a daredevil fellow, and the humanity that accepted his dispensation must be a humanity quite different from the one we are acquainted with. It is unimaginable that the law of caste was given. It is hardly an exaggeration to say that Manu could not have outlived his law, for what is that class that can submit to be degraded to the status of brutes by the pen of a man and suffer him to raise another class to the pinnacle? Unless he was a tyrant who had all the population in subjection, it cannot be imagined that he could have been allowed to dispense his patronage in this grossly unjust manner, as may be easily seen by a mere glance at his institutes. I may seem hard on Manu, but I am sure my force is not strong enough to kill his ghost. He lives like a disembodied spirit and is appealed to, and I am afraid will yet live long. One thing I want to impress upon you is that Manu did not give the law of caste and that he could not do so. Caste existed long before Manu. He was an upholder of it and therefore philosophized about it, but certainly he did not and could not ordain the present order of Hindu society. His work ended with the codification of existing caste rules and the preaching of caste dharma. The spread and growth of the caste system is too gigantic a task to be achieved by the power or cunning of an individual or of a class.